this will probably be aired the second week in October, and the other one will have gone the first week.
Yes.
So we'll just sort of try and pick it up from there if we can. And we want to get it into the binary stuff. And then hopefully this might be able to be streamed. They've been streaming things here to the internet. You could pick it up in England if you're back in England.
Extraordinary technology.
It is, yeah, that it's happening now.
Yes.
It's really good, yeah. Welcome back to Conversations. We're continuing on a program that was carried, the first part of which was carried last week, and we're talking now with Rodney Shakespeare, and he's the co-author of a book. Let's show it right here at the outset. If you can pick that up, Rodney, let's show it again. It's called Binary Economics, and it's subtitled The New Paradigm, and he is the co-author along with Robert Ashford of this book, which picks up on the idea of an alternative economic way of seeing the world. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you now to a second hour of talking here in the aftermath of the World Trade Center bombing. And Rodney, welcome once again to Conversation. Last week we were talking, for those who may have been viewing, we were talking about picking up on the thinking of Buckminster Fuller's very large theme, and a very large theme that the adverse side of the destructive capability that is inherent within the condition, the human condition now, that we may have made a gigantic transition in terms of the ontology. The ontology is the science of understanding of reality.
Yes.
And the reality can change through time. There was 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs were king of the, were in charge of this planet, as it were. There was a comet that came out of the universe, hit it, and the reality changed.
Right.
We came 200,000 years ago, and we were put in like an Eden way in terms of our relationship to the environment, but we had a unique capability intellectually of being able to create technology, an extension of our consciousness into the environment, making the environment other than what is given. And through 200,000 years, we've reached a point now where we do have, through atomic, hydrogen, bacteriological, weapons systems now that can turn biology on its head. We have the capability that we've devised through our intellectual capability, creating an alternative environmental reality or an ontology that means that we could destroy our species. We're the only species that's had the power to be able to do that in terms of the environment. We've reached that point now. The adverse side of that might be that that technological capability has given us the scientific ability to understand that the reality has changed in terms of the political and economic context, that we may have, with our technological capability, transcended the condition of scarcity within which all human society and all history had developed, and that's something that has gone unnoticed by the intellectual community, artists and scientists and people that have done it. He put that position forth, and he said that we crossed that line where there were more haves than have-nots around 1970, and that we've been galloping into a condition where we have the ability to provide life support for all of this, the 6 billion human beings heading for 10, and that we have that ability within an ecological context, that would be the averse or liberating side of what the potentiality of the reality is, and that never comes up as something that seems to me to be a context within which it might be well to think about economics.
Well, the insight of Buckminster Fuller that the world is capable of producing sufficient to solve all problems of poverty, that insight was made roughly around about 1970, and you're one of the few people, Harold, who in fact took that insight up, and it has been upheld in the world as a thing of value by you and by Norman Kurland of the Center for Economic and Social Justice in Washington, D.C. That insight is crucial if there's to be any change in thinking, and we've reached a point now of immense danger, and unless we are able to do our rethinking, then there is a complete catastrophe possible for the human race. And unfortunately, given that an attack has been made on the pinnacles of a deliberate attack has been made on the pinnacles of a civilization, and it's been done in a monstrous way, the realities are that all the thinking is likely to shut down and that the intellectuals will feel themselves unable to raise even the first sliver of new thinking.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, whereas on the one hand immense danger and an immense opportunity, there is a necessity for new thinking, but alas the situation is very bad, and it may not happen unless intellectuals consciously take this opportunity now. Accepting the dangers of the situation, they have to actually see the opportunity. If they don't, the whole thing will go by default, and the societies will shut down and just end up basically fighting with each other.
Well, we may have the ability to fight with one another, and we could discuss some of those realities. This idea that the war that is being declared now, that we're making a war against, we're going to fight terrorism, and that's going to be the enemy, as opposed to, let's say, we were fighting communism at the time before the implosion of the Soviet Union. We're going to fight terrorism, and there should be a good dictionary definition of what exactly we mean by that. It seems to me. I mean, I know George III called George Washington a terrorist.
Yes.
I know that Nelson Mandela was called widely a terrorist by the South African forces that be and so forth. And what we exactly mean by a terrorist, and we have state terrorism that has been enacted by people who are able to intimidate others within the name of realpolitik, power and so forth. But it's a term that ought to be very carefully dealt with, it seems to me, as well.
Yes. People who are opposed to the particular one structure will be called terrorists. But if you are honest about it, you are able to identify what that terrorist's aims are. You may not agree with them, but you are able to identify it. But there is a particular problem. Whereas with communism, you could actually say what it meant in practice. It's
in economic terms.
In economic terms. Before it was actually put into practice, you couldn't necessarily have seen all the consequences of it. And a lot of those consequences were not foreseen. But in the present situation, there are factors where you can certainly identify where some of the support comes for the terrorist position. But if you then say, well, now, give power to the terrorists so they actually implement their economics and their politics, then on the one hand it may not be clear, on the other hand it may be only too clear. So I look more to looking at the issues where people support, possibly in desperation, they support the terrorists. And these are the issues here you can see are poverty, extremes of wealth, and a lack of dignity for people in their lives, an inability to control their own lives. And I think all these things lead to extreme hardline positions and a willingness to attack those who they perceive as being successful in the world, those who blame for their failure in their own societies. The failures get projected outside. So I can understand all that. I point out that the terrorists, if given power, as far as one knows, what would actually happen in life would be a very low standard of living. It would be one in which no woman could even walk down the street in a summer dress. She'd get acid in her face. So those are the realities. And those who support the terrorists do have to ask themselves, it may be that they are against capitalism, they're against this and that. They have to be honest and say, well, what is it that in practice they're also for? And that, I suspect, is the big area which we must address. The West must not say that it's got everything right. It must come up with new thinking, and it must address the major problems of the world. At the same time, those who are supporting the terrorists, and there are a lot of people who are supporting the terrorists, they also must be honest and say, what do they stand for, and do they have any new thinking to solve the world's problems?
Yeah, we spoke earlier about the great number of people who have protested the way things are.
Yes.
At Genoa, there were 200,000 on the streets in Genoa, Seattle, that sort of thing. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund, the world system that is in place, the economic reality, is being protested by a number of people that are not Islamicist or something of that sort. They're protesting the way things are.
Yes.
And James Wolferson is very likely to say to these young men or people that are on the streets who come down and say, we sense something is wrong, something is going on, we've had, this sort of thing. They would say, well, what is your alternative to the way we have structured things. The economic theory that would inform what you're doing. Remember, those people might have an economic theory along socialist or communist lines. Fidel Castro has an interesting posting on the internet now and so forth. They might have that. But that they would ask that question, and they need to come up with an answer. And in an existential crisis that we're in, it's incumbent upon those who want to, I would suggest, in a real radical vein, it's incumbent for those to come up with an alternative that is so comprehensively appropriate to the problems that confront mankind that would be liberating of that 80% of the population of the world that is not doing well, and the trends are not those that are going to make it possible for them to do well, but also could be understood by, in the fullness of intellectual candor and so forth, an alternative that would be able to be understood by and gone along with those responsible for the historically inherited institutions. That's the challenge, and we're not, we're now falling back into dialectic clashing of power rather than addressing the underlying questions of what alternative might be able to be provided that could bring us to that happy pass in terms of the evolution of events broader on this planet. One of the components of that would be the analysis that's contained within what is called binary economics that you have worked out. And as we discussed last week, that stands aside from, outside the envelope, is different than the thinking of virtually all economic theory. And economic theory, even though it sounds esoteric, ephemeral, abstract, is of the essence in terms of understanding policy, because it is economics that informs the political process itself.
Decides all.
So the intellectual challenge of understanding an economic analysis would be perhaps of the essence in terms of one that might nest with Buckminster Fuller's notion that we have transcended scarcity as an ontological beginning point for this. And it's there that the intellectual community might do well to concentrate its efforts to try and make sure we can move things in a right direction at this existential moment in the evolution of universal consciousness.
If you take the globalization protesters who have come to the fore, Seattle and Genoa, they do have a problem. They represent many, many groups, and they know this area and that area, this is what they're for. But in the sense, you're quite right, that in the sense of having some sort of cohesive policy to put up against the existing power structures and the existing ideas, something which can be comprehensible and fits the circumstances of the day. They do not have that. And indeed, Harold, I believe that on one of the American networks, a journalist went to a demonstrator and said, look, I'll give you a minute or 2 minutes
What's your alternative?
to say what you are for, and he did not get an answer. And so that is the challenge in the situation.
Well, there might be one thing for a young demonstrator to be demonstrating against a situation maybe just out of their own circumstance. I mean that you have so many people that it's just sensed that something's wrong. That maybe there are people in their own, much of the third world. We have these things developing in Africa, other parts of the world that they can sense. It's a disaster story that goes on in much of the world, and the trends are not in the right direction. The concentration, the disequilibrium of wealth and comfort and so forth in the world is growing to the advantage of those that are already advantaged. So they may not have an answer, but they have a gut reaction to the fact that something's wrong and we need something right.
I would put it
and
differently.
the responsibility mustn't necessarily be with those young people who are protesting and saying something's wrong. Bobby Dylan said something's blowing in the wind, there's something there. It's up to the intellectual community to come up with some sort of an understanding that can fill the gap of intellectual understanding rather than just to retreat into xenophobia and so forth, I would submit.
I would think those young people don't sense that something is wrong. They know that something is wrong. What I think they sense is that they sense that there is a possibility of improving things and getting right.
Absolutely.
That feeling is inside them, but the intellectual solutions are inchoate and unformed. And it's not fair to ask a demonstrator of the street what they should be for, but it really is up to the intellectual world to provide something which is short, simple, comprehensible, can be put across so that it can be taken up by that young man or that young woman.
Or the policymakers.
Or by
ultimately, the policymakers have...
And then everyone can refer back to the books and the papers and the fancier stuff. But certain messages must be got.
So in the realm of economics, then we have this notion of binary economics, and we'll come back to that because it's radical. in the sense of being outside the envelope of the traditional way. We have one graphic that we want to show, if we could. We showed one last time, but we have one graphic we want to show, if I could. It is to talk about the fact that we said that all of the economic theories from Adam Smith through and including Marx to Schumpeter to Keynes to Van Hayek and what informs the political classes of the world today were based on the labor theory of value. We're going to distribute income by labor values. And that this is a chart that comes out of the binary literature, if I can. Some people might take exception to it. But in general, maybe we could point out, this is a chart that tries to measure, as we move into the modern experience, this is the work, this is the contribution to production in an economic analysis theory. Or maybe you could show it, Rodney. Why don't you explain it?
Yes, okay.
Because
this diagram is drawn by Louis and Patricia Kelso, who are the progenitors with Mortimer Adler of binary economics. And what it actually shows is that over time, human labour is very, very important, but you mustn't forget the increasing importance of the non-human input. That non-human input is illustrated by, say, a machine. It can be a technological process, it can be a patent. But so there's the human and there's the non-human, and the input of the non-human relative to the human is massively increasing. Now, Howard, just now you said that some people might have some difficulty in accepting this. I'm afraid people's minds at the moment are conditioned into the belief that everything is done by human labour, and they don't want to accept it. But just go and look at the automatic factory. I saw my first automatic factory nearly 40 years ago. I spare you the details, but you cannot explain an automatic factory which has no labour in terms of human input. Well, there are repair people, there are those who built it, those who designed it, but the actual production is done by the automated factory.
If I could, now this is 1776 here.
That's the
so this
American
would have been
Revolution
the time,
and the start of the Industrial
And come back and show the whole chart if you could, Frank, please. It comes back, this would be, one analysis would be the time of Thomas Jefferson, this is the American economy.
Right.
The American economy, in a very real sense, is, in a certain sense, the leading economy and can be the model for the world.
Sure.
If we had a model that was appropriate and worthy of emulation, might be different than that we do not have because we're at a policy level, we don't have the right assumptions. But this would have been the time of, stay on the chart, this would have been the time of Thomas Jefferson. The part down here is something other than labor's contribution at the bottom of that chart.
That's right.
That would have been maybe a hammer. A fellow would have a hammer, and it would take him, the rest of this is labor's contribution to the making of a pair of boots. All of this, right?
This is hammer, it's hand
And this is the technology. Very, very
slight.
slight.
It's not machinery, it's
and
not
this is the time of Adam Smith.
Yes.
And the tendency through time that we have with technology, and it's growing exponentially upon exponential now, that the technological aspects of production are growing monumentally to where some of these labor people, these binary people will say over here, it might be up close to, it's reversed, maybe as much as 80% or 90% of the actual production is not the result of labor, whether physical or intellectual. It's the result of technological instruments, and we're galloping into a world of potential displacement of labor through automated processes, and yet we still have a labor theory of value where, for the vast majority of the population, since all of these technological instruments and abstract financial things like patent rights and so forth are owned by 5% of the population, the vast majority of people have and are only expected to have, and only in their own rights expect to have, a labor relationship to production where they will gain income for life's purposes by having what we call a job or a labor participation in the economy. And there's a mismatch in that, is there not, if these figures are correct?
There is a mismatch, and you put it very clearly. Certainly some human beings are increasing their input. But the point is that the non-human input, the machinery and the patents and the technology, relatively is increasing its input even more.
Yeah.
So if this is happening, it is happening on a tremendous scale, and will happen even more, you then get down to who or why or what controls that non-human input. And if you don't own it, you don't control it, then the mass of people are going to be relying only on their jobs for their income, and their jobs are not secure, they're not necessarily paying enough, and they can get wiped out and kicked off, and have all the disasters of being unemployed.
Now, we have had in the United States in these past years, under Mr. Clinton's administration by and large, we were amazed, and Mr. Greenspan at the Federal Reserve Board and so forth, that we were able to have unemployment rates only all the way down to 3.9% and so forth.
Well, you manipulate
and
the
without inflation, seemingly, and it seemed to be a mystery, and we were still using a monetarist policy and that sort of thing, and that the employment went very well. Now there was a problem in the more recent experience with that, and there are many people who are saying we've just had massive layoffs among people in the airline industry, other industries and so forth. These are things that cyclically happen within an economy, but if it's correct that if this is correct, and this is another one, we said in the program last week that they should have an all-out study of whether or not we have, in fact, as a collective society, transcended scarcity, or if that should be something that should be an object of scenario and study and so forth. This is another one that should be. Is this in fact the case? This is an assumption made by them. If this is the case, then by having the vast majority of the population only gaining income by a labor relationship to which the labor relationship contribution is really only 10%, we're working into a situation that is not in touch with the actual reality, because they have no ownership or no way of relating to the productive capability directly that the technology and the instances of a modern society, modern economic order have inherent to them. So it's out of whack with reality.
It's out of whack with reality. You were talking about the employment under the Clinton years. In practice, the situation is distorted and manipulated. Certainly in the United Kingdom, the figures of those who are in the labour market are not true figures at all. They are figures about those who are are trying to apply to be in the labour market and who are then applying for benefit. In practice, millions of people exclude themselves and get fed up, and in the UK they can go and then go on to state benefits. And then you have an increasing proportion of people who spend longer and longer in education. I think you can argue that the length of education and the numbers in the UK now is a method of keeping people off the employment
Yeah,
market.
well, same here, yeah.
And it will probably be the same in the USA. And at the other end of the scale, people are being early retired, and one way or another being manipulated out. And you're getting this longer and longer period of life which goes on, and a relatively shorter and shorter period of people being in work. You're able to do this primarily because of the advances of the capital, of the productive capital. And then, as you rightly say, the key issue for the future is whether you can spread that ownership. And unfortunately, minds at the moment are completely locked. I have to say, Howard, unless they open up this one, then you've got a rigidity of position. And at the moment, if the West, we put it like that, if the West intellectually takes too rigid a position and thinks there is only one solution, in the present situation, it is dangerous beyond belief. They have to start rethinking on these major issues. And in a previous program, you and I raised two big issues as to opening up the thinking. The first was this idea of who or what creates the wealth. We must rethink that. The second one is the one that you've dealt with a bit today, which is the Buckminster Fuller idea, the one which you yourself were putting out with consequences in your own personal life in the early 70s. The understanding the productive capacity is there. We've got to change the structures so that everyone can have a fair share of what is physically capable.
Well, yeah, that would subsume an awful lot of
That
things.
would subsume a lot, but there's one more, Howard, which I'd like to introduce, because this is a subject which, generally speaking, it is touched on in economics textbooks, but then it is sidelined as being minimal. If you actually raise it in the political level, I can tell you you will be ignored. If you raise it in the universities, you can put your career on the line. It is the subject of money. And I'd like to put it on with you today.
By all means.
There's an aspect of this which, if we just raise it and think about it, that just doing that could unlock a lot of the new thinking. The thing I would like to raise is that everybody should consider where money comes from. Because if you ask you ask me or the man in the street, ask anybody where money comes from, they will say, oh, it comes from the banks. And I say, well, if I borrow money from the bank, where does that come from? Well, the answer is it's somebody else's savings.
Yeah,
now,
that's what people would probably say.
all right, that's what people believe. But it isn't true. I spare you some of the history on this, but a situation has actually arisen in which somewhere around about 95, it may be even 97% of the money supply is not other people's money being lent. It is new money being created out of nothing by the private banking system, which is adding interest. Now, you may say, well, so what? Well, the first problem is, and here is the amazing fact about this, is that if you actually ask about this fact, a fact which is reflected in numerical statistics, if you ask about it, you are told, firstly, if you go to one central bank, that it isn't true. Central Bank of Australia was asked about this. If you then go to the Central Bank of New Zealand and ask the same question, then you get the completely opposite. In the first case, in the former, there was a denial that the private banking system creates money, and in the second case in New Zealand, there was an immediate admission that 97% of the money supply is actually created by the private sector.
Is that a semantics problem or a confusion or what? How do we do that? Or is there a thing? And what about the Federal Reserve Board here, which is our central banking system?
This question has been asked by a lot of monetary reformers, and you can have a charitable view and an uncharitable view. The uncharitable view is that it is deliberate obfuscation or even fraud. And the charitable view is that there are linguistic concepts and that maybe even the top bankers don't really understand how the system works. Now that might seem absolutely impossible. But you have to explain why is it you're getting these contradictions on this key thing. Well, I think I know what the answer is. It is that it is a mixture of, it is some deliberate obfuscation. There is some uncertainty about it, but this is the key subject which, if you debate, you actually unlock all the other subjects. You just think a minute. Supposing you say, well, okay, the facts do show that all this money is created out of nothing, interest is added, and then it's paid back. Well, there are certain consequences. It means all the time so much money is created, but even more money has to be paid back.
The interest is...
It is
that's the interest rate.
That's the interest. Right? We're not talking about administration charges.
No,
We're talking about the interest, interest rate. If you understand that, then you say to yourself, well, excuse me, but I thought governments should or could create money. It raises that possibility. And then you say to yourself, well, now, if governments should or create money, could they do this without adding interest? Administration costs, yes, but without adding... 0.5%
or something, or 1/4% or something? Yeah.
And why shouldn't, for example, the federal bank in the USA use, I think it's Section 13, where the power is there? And whereupon they will immediately turn around and say, well, we can't possibly do this. The private sector does it very well. Well, you can then say, well, does it do it very well? Let's take public capital investment. If in the USA you want to build a fire station, a local governmental authority will borrow that money from the private sector and will pay interest. And the cost will be, shall we say, $1 million. But if you did it without interest, the cost might be as little as $330,000 or $400,000. So if you just get
anybody who's done a mortgage with a house.
Well, in the mortgage with a house, people, well, they're precisely that.
Yeah.
Now, this is not proposing an extension of the public sector. It is just saying that if we build our fire station, why shouldn't we do it at 1/3 or 1/2 the cost? Now, Howard, I know of only one argument which has come from conventional thinking on this point, and it is a completely preposterous argument. The argument which is put forward is, oh, but we must have interest. This raises the cost and ensures that the cost is spread over the generations. It is fair to spread the cost of a fire station.
Well, that's because they need to have an interest rate that's going to make it possible for them to get investments on long-term bonds or something like that?
Well, I think the argument is you have to put the price so much is that it can never be repaid in 5 years, and therefore it can only be repaid in 30 years. It is a preposterous argument, Howard. It is quite simple. If you halve the cost of something, then I can pay up so much of the cost, and the next generation can pay up the most of the cost. If you double the cost, then I have to pay up double as much, and so does the next generation.
There's a movement in this country. I think there's a House resolution, was it 1452, I think.
1452.
That's there that a great number of people in the public sector have supported this.
There is an extraordinary movement in the USA. It's I think it's called Sovereignty Loan Movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it has signed up the support of, I think it's 3,400, somewhere around about there, United States governmental organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, 5 of them are states,
Mm-hmm.
and a state is a country.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's so many populations over 250,000 or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and then populations over 100,000.
Mm-hmm.
And some are the tiny authorities, the school authorities and the
Yeah.
fire station authorities, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But they're all governmental bodies,
Mm-hmm.
and all who there wish to validly ask the question, why shouldn't it be done?
Mm-hmm.
And there is, as far as I know, there is no argument against it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you see, this question, you raise it in a very fundamental way, opens up issues and makes you start to think.
Now, we have had, Japan has gotten down to where they have no interest at all. The central bank, no interest. If they pay money to take the loans or something. So what does that say about the long-term growth potentiality of a thing, or the growth of our, and Mr. Greenspan has tried to lower in a monetarist kind of way, it's down,
You do
the
not
prime rate
have
is now down.
Yes, the situation is so bad
He'll
in
do
Japan.
it again, I'm sure.
Is that they this very low rate, and well, I may even go into the rates the other way.
Yeah,
Anything
I think
seems
so,
to be possible.
Yeah.
But you see, the moment if you raise these issues, here you've given the facts of Japan,
Mm.
and I've given you an argument which is supported by all these governmental bodies in the United States,
Yeah.
and then you just look at the sheer logic,
Mhm.
and all those things tell you that the thing can be done, and
Uh-huh.
it can be done very simply for public capital investment.
Mhm.
There are some people who in the United States who you would call libertarians,
Mhm.
who would say, oh, we don't want anything to do with the public sector. That is another argument, Harold.
Yeah.
If you have a public sector, then let it be cheaply.
Mhm.
And there is, incidentally, there's always going to be, even the libertarians
Mhm.
have to have courts to implement their normal commercial contracts.
Yeah.
And even libertarians presumably want some form of defence and presumably want some sort of environmental regulation.
Yeah.
So I mean, government has to exist in
Yeah.
all sorts of ways.
Mhm.
So I don't think so. The argument there should be no public sector is a lot of nonsense.
Mhm.
So that raises that, and then when you raise this question of the use of interest-free money, then it opens up to your binary economics.
So now make that connection.
All right. In binary economics, it enables over time all individuals, in work, out of work, carers, retired, anybody, to come to substantial capital ownership, paying out a very large capital income.
Mhm.
That's a slightly different issue. But you say, well, how do they come to this ownership?
Mhm.
At the moment, they cannot do it because they do not have the savings to do that in the first place. And secondly, if they borrowed, say, £500,000 or whatever, they do not have what's called collateral.
Mhm.
And that simply, if the loan goes wrong, have they got something like a house to put up or other shares which can be taken by the bankers for the loss of the money.
Yeah, right.
But the proposal here is that if you could give people without capital some sort of financial advantage, so that when they invest, that it pays a corporation to use them as the investors,
Mhm.
then you can say, oh, look, there's an advantage for these people.
You mean a process of democratizing the ownership?
It is a process of democratizing or socializing or ensuring that everybody has a silver spoon in their mouth.
Mm.
Now, the way you would do that would say to a company, all right, this company, you want to expand. Okay. You can, at the moment, do it by what's called retained earnings. And this means basically a company saves money and then just invests. Well,
That's where it does.
that's what it does at the moment.
Yeah.
And if it does that, it means that the value of the new investment stays within the company. And one of the reasons, independently of the ups and downs of the stock market, but one of the reasons why capital owners, existing capital owners, get wealthier and wealthier is because of that concentration mechanism.
Takes money to make money.
It takes money to make money, and if you invest out of capital retained earnings,
Mhm.
the value, magnificent productive value, goes to the existing owners
Yeah.
of the company.
And that's happening planetary-wide now.
Oh, it's happening all the time.
Yeah.
It's happening on a huge scale all the time.
That's why we have such a concentration of
It's why
wealth
there's the
and-
concentration, is why it will never, for all the rhetoric about the stock market is widening, up to 45% of the American people have some sort of connection with the stock market. It is minuscule and it pays out virtually nothing.
Yeah, right. We're not, if those figures that we showed in that little chart were 80%, this is just an abstract thing, if 80%, as they claim, of the actual production is something other than labor, there would be a certain rough logic that would be that for the population of the whole of the country, 80% of your income for living should be coming, if it was wired right, should be coming from something other than your labor activity.
That's right.
That is not the case at all in simple logic. We have the Employment Act of 1946 is the basic policy grounding statement for the United States, and that we will distribute income to the mass through labor relationship to a productive process that's becoming increasingly...
labor or through welfare benefit.
And I want, you know, there was a thing, if I could, Lord Keynes, many people, remember Mr. Nixon one time said that we're all Keynesians now, he said in about 1970 and so forth. And Keynes is one of the great thinkers and so forth, but I have a quote from him, and it seems to me worth considering because there's a great number of people who are of a Keynesian turn of mind and so forth that are in positions of responsibility. And this is a quote from Charles Handy. He had written the book The Hungry Spirit, Beyond Capitalism, A Quest for Purpose in the Modern World, 1998. And he had a thing at Keynes, turning from economics to philosophy in his 1930 essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, saw it all. So this is a projection from 1930 for his grandchildren, which is about now. This is about his grandchildren's generation coming.
Depth of the recession, was it?
And yeah, in this 1930, there was the Depression, but he was looking ahead, and he was looking ahead to this, and again, we're talking the idea that the production is increasingly being technological. We haven't even gotten into the incredible capabilities of artificial intelligence and things that are evolving now, the computer, the wonders of that sort of thing which are going. But he said, this is a quote from Keynes, he said, "We are being afflicted with a new disease of which some readers may not yet have heard the name, but of which they will hear a great deal in the years to come, namely technological unemployment. This means unemployment due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor, outrunning the pace at which we can find new uses for labor. This means that the economic problem is not, if we look into the future, the permanent problem of the human race. Technological unemployment. And it goes on. Keynes goes on to say that once the economic problem is solved, now, you and I would be trying to suggest means by which the economic problem might be solved. That's a big conundrum that confronts us existentially now and is not in the cards in terms of what's directing national or international policy at the moment. Mankind will be deprived of its traditional purpose and will be faced with the real problem which economics will have won, how to live wisely, agreeably, and well.
Yes.
He doesn't think that this will be welcomed by all. That is Mr. Keynes, he's now quoting Keynes. He doesn't think that this will be not welcomed. Quote, now it's quote Keynes, "There is no country and no people, I think, who can look forward to the age of abundance," which is the Buckminster Fuller notion of we're transcending abundance and maybe exponentially being able to provide for everyone, but we don't do it.
Right.
But without dread. But ultimately, when the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance, that's probably going to be, now it's the only thing of importance in the world now, is everything is being commoditized. But he says, of high social importance, there will be great changes in the code of morals. We shall be able to assess the money motive at its true value. So that's from Mr. Keynes, who was a great stimulator, you know, demand-side thinking of Mr. Roosevelt and a lot of what is the liberal policy and so forth, saying and projecting that he thinks that we are heading for technological unemployment. That's a possibility that tends not to be assumed, that if the economy is humming along, we will be able to create jobs for everyone, and that also by concentrating on the creating jobs for everyone keeps us away from the idea of trying to measure what's actually being produced and relating by ownership to that which is being democratizing the economic assets of the country and so forth. from that question, because it seems to be politically inconvenient to the way things have been and are organized and the lines of authority and so forth. But it seems to me to be a big question he addresses, and the technological unemployment has a tremendous productive capability, but if people are unemployed, they can't buy, they won't have the income to buy what can be technologically involved, so there has to be an alternative way for people to have income other than only, as is the case now, employment for 95% of the population.
This is a remarkable statement, but there seems to be just one bit of a contradiction here. On the one hand, he's clearly foreseeing increased wealth and technological achievement. And then on the other hand, he says, ultimately, when the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance.
That's probably 30 years out or something.
Well, if people feel secure, and by feel secure I mean they actually have secure, and then there are two generations of that, then I think that
the angst
might
be reduced.
The fear of poverty and all those rather destructive social attitudes like wanting to
bomb the
flaunt.
World Trade Center.
Yeah, well, indeed.
Very real, possibly.
Indeed.
Yeah.
You'll only change people's attitudes, those social attitudes, when in fact everybody has a degree of genuine security and is genuinely productive. At the moment, I'm afraid that the self-made tend to be self-righteous about it and say, well, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, and, you know, why aren't you doing this? And putting it bluntly, they despise those who've not done the same.
Yeah.
And those who've not done it at the same time are in this sort of game where they have to go forward and feel they've achieved, but they never feel secure. And a lot of negative attitudes towards each other come from that. And it's either, I believe, either actual poverty or fear or perception of poverty are some of the most destructive attitudes of all. Now, at the moment, we've got no answer to it. I think Keynes is seeing the technological possibility, but he himself, on the one hand, while he's saying jobs would disappear, he himself only provided for jobs.
Well, it was
Keynes did not come for capital ownership.
Yeah, it was the Bretton Woods institutions that we now are talking about. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund were set up by him at Bretton Woods and so forth, and set up the pattern that, you know, we're coming into.
I think
but it still doesn't mean that it doesn't call. The question is the system that's in place, as you quoted Fukuyama and so forth, saying, is the system that's in place? Mr. Wolfenson will say to those young people, you just don't understand. This is the way it is. These are the realities. They will use, we have a term, realpolitik. They'll use the word real economique or something, that this is the way it is, and people only have to understand that, but there's going to be opposition to that. And if there's an alternative, the only one that is an alternative outside of the normal laissez-faire to communist spectrum that we call economics is this system that you've had such a pioneering work in trying to set forth.
It can be quite hard to get across binary economics because some of the concepts are very original. You're having to rethink how you understand reality. You have to, well, know your beliefs about how wealth is created. But homing in now on something here is to give that young man who's speaking to the director of the World Bank or somebody a simple way of raising the issues and sort of turning the debate. I suggest he just ask that one question, which is, please tell me, how is money created, and is it true that it is 97% or 95% is created by the private banking system and interest is added?
Now, how would that solve the problem?
Well, directly, it doesn't solve anything at all. All it does is it directs attention to an area of understanding, and I'll make a prophecy here, is that once you have that area openly debated, then all the thinking will start to open up for new possibility. This is the area where they will avoid that young man's question if he asks it. They will lie to him, they will ignore him, they say, don't waste my time, or anybody who...
In protecting the system as it is, what aspects of the system would they be lying to him about in order to protect?
Well,
would be the high interest rate earnings by
money
our
systems,
financial institutions and individuals that make them up, our investment houses, our investment bankers, or our central bankers, or who would, what would they be trying to maintain, and for whose benefit would they be trying to maintain it?
You're ultimately maintaining the narrow ownership of capital.
Okay.
You're ultimately condemning most of the world to such job opportunities as they are, remembering that the jobs for most people in terms of numbers throughout the world are very, very poor indeed. They just don't provide anything. We've previously discussed the fundamental statistic that 55% of the world's population, way over half, survive on under $3 a day. You know, and some of them only have $1 a day. So you're looking at a world where the technological capacity exists. How to open up the new thinking? And I'm suggesting you do it by asking this question. And then watch and see what happens to the answers. Watch as you are lied to, or you are ignored, or you are sneered at, and home in on it and keep pressing, remembering that you can go straight to the figures, the Bank of England figures or the Federal Reserve figures, and there are books.
And in view of
analysts
that, and if there was not obfuscation or ignoring or attacking of that, what would be the policy suggestions that would be made that could help make the world better for the citizenry of the world in view of this fact that would be, you know,
I just move to the second one here, which is we call them 4 demands for a non-inflationary money system. Just move to the second one, which is the sovereignty loan movement in America.
And that's growing.
Well, it's growing.
It's growing. And nascent. It's
got a simple winning argument, but it ultimately does challenge intellectually the existing structure.
Yeah.
But the circumstances are changing. A big push on this one, and it's bound to win. And as that one wins, then it opens the way immediately for the use of interest-free money on the same principle in the private sector. Here, it's the same principle. It's the money goes out, builds not the fire station, but builds the factory. It is then paid back, and it can be cancelled. Harold, I have to tell you, this is not, it's not anti-inflationary. It's massively the opposite of inflationary, because you're producing new productive capacity, and at the same time you're producing new consumers with new power, and the money supply, once it's paid back, is cancelled. In terms of the money out there, you may have a bit of a problem. You may have to actually pump the money supply in using debt-free money or something like this. But there can be no question of inflation. And also, all the time, as soon as there's a market decision to make a new investment, you first of all, you'll do it on cheap money, the interest-free money. And secondly...
Now, who's going to lose by that?
Well, if the whole thing leads to growth, and growth of an appropriate sort is not a bad thing.
No, growth is very important to maintain growth.
Nobody need lose. We're back to your Buckminster Fuller. If there is an overall capacity, it may happen that relatively, in what we're proposing, the poor do better relatively than to the rich. But if the rich benefit more than they would otherwise have done, then in logic, they have no reason to object. But there is a problem in psychology. And that problem is that, and this was found by Louis Kelso long ago when he talked with people. He said that what always used to come up at the end of the day, late in the night, when they'd pushed the argument and the conversations through and got to the nitty-gritty of what people were up to in their positions, the basic argument would get down to be, well, I'm on top and I like it that way and I'm going to stay there, would say an existing wealthy person, even if his money had been inherited, etc., etc. And there'll be no concept of, oh, well, if the whole thing, and I benefit as a rich person even more, the objection would be simply to stopping other people. Now, that
also, it's good to
there is a problem with that, Howard.
Yeah, there is.
It exists, but it's a very real result.
It's also good to have all these wage slaves that will do what it is as you go through the public sector, the public arena. Or you have all these people that are beholden to those few who control, so that they keep them in. It's profoundly undemocratic in its notion.
This relates very much also to the position of women in the world.
Women, another grand group.
I have been recently raising the subject of binary economics with some feminist economists, and I can tell you that some are sympathetic, are highly sympathetic, but others at the moment just do not see that if they propose, say, a communist or a socialist solution, as some of them actually do, then women will be controlled just as much as they are now. But if any feminist economists out there now listening to this program want a tip, they should go for something which genuinely gives a likelihood and a possibility that each individual woman can have an independent earning capacity. If they don't have that, then I'm afraid that you can forget any long-term achievements of feminine on any substantial scale for all women. They will achieve for some women in some structure, in some societies, like the United States and the UK. But on the world scale, you've got to home in on that one, otherwise women will always be in a weak position. They will always be beaten up, manipulated and knocked around.
Well, that's the way we have it now, not only women, but people in general. I mean, because the claims of wage slavery is very much the case with most of the people in the world now. They must do what they to earn their living and so forth. And if you have a world where people have an independent source of economic security, apart from them labor, back again to that fact that the figures that is 90% of it is not labor related. If they had an income, 90% of their income was coming for them to do what it is they want to do rather than what they must do in order to the dictates of the people who do control everything, it'd be a very, very different kind of world, would it not?
It would be a different...
I mean, and that might be some time out before that can project that coming into being, but if we had a way that can lead toward that economic democratization rather than the continued economic plutocracy that is the case now, that is in the realm of the radical kind of solution that a lot of people are looking for the solution to, born of their angst, it's, as Bobby Dylan said, blowing in the wind round this planet and causing a great deal of the blowback to the people who represent this system, with people that are in varying ways saying something new is needed and new ideas should be given a hearing rather than just routinely dismissed as they tend to be by the people that say everything's hunky-dory.
And these new ideas, which we're just touching on now, could be of huge appeal to the Islamic world.
Oh, absolutely. It could fit there. It could, and to that radical group that see the need for change and liberation, as it were, from oppressive institutions for the mass, but also, in the fullness of time, and with the fact that there are great numbers of people within the established way of doing things, of goodwill and so forth, who might be jolted by this event that happened here in New York into thinking about, let's think about something new. You present an alternative that makes sense. We can't present an alternative to them that doesn't make sense or is anarchistic. They have to set the standard high. But this is something that could be meeting the high standards of those who skeptically or would say, well, what do you, alternative? Look at the alternative. This is an alternative. The traditional alternatives don't work. But this one might be the kernel of what would make an alternative work that could be liberating, as it were, of the mass, involving the 80% of the body politic of the world in a legitimate and just way, a workable way, and also those who traditionally have been responsible for our historically inherited institutions seeing a way toward change, if you understand.
I do understand, and it could draw the rug from the violence of the terrorism which is going out the world, because this could appeal to the Islamic world on several key matters. One of them is this question of using interest-free money. Now, there are a few complications here as to what it goes on in the existing Islamic world and how they actually get around this, but the actual principle of what is being proposed can be used in the Islamic world as it can be in the West, and it can be used to liberate the masses, give individuals economic power, give more dignity. For those reasons, it may not well be acceptable to the plutocratic and autocratic structures, a number of which we do
Well, that's
exist.
what happened to the kings of France, didn't they? And they ended up getting their heads cut off, which might be something that could be of note to others, because there could be a backlash to this. And there's a need for there to be, like the genome and the knowledge and the fact that we've come to this point that, again, the eminent scientists will say we're coming to the point after 200,000 years of human evolution to the point where we can destroy our species. Within the last 10 years or so we've come to that. The adverse side of that might be something that is very loosely been able to be seen as something like liberation, We know the genome. We got 100 trillion cells in the human organism. Each one is maximally involved and must be involved in a healthy organism. We got 6 billion human beings heading for 10, and they all have to be able to participate maximally if we're to realize the fulfilling of what our purpose is. We may be at a time of, in a certain very real sense, coming to the end of 200,000 years, and we're coming into a new collectively seen liaison with consciousness at another level transcended to human consciousness, and it's important that that not be something that's just reserved for a few plutocrats that are going to go off in a spaceship while the rest of the world can be allowed to rot in their own AIDS or whatever, because they're not going to be needed in the traditional political economic context. There has to be an understanding ethical of the whole of the human society in an ecological association.
Yes.
In order to fulfill human purpose and biological evolutionary purpose in this part of the universe at this existentially, crucially challenging time. So the nitpicking argumentations about some of these people, some of these plutocrats and others, could be subsumed within a larger context of understanding, and that's the intellectual challenge that is before us.
If I may just take you just on one aspect
got a couple
of,
minutes left,
okay,
yeah.
on the French Revolution. Where in the French Revolution, as soon as they started to reform, the whole thing blew up. But in these type of proposals, the existing structures can take them on board, and they are gentle, there's no violence, and violence cannot come out of them.
Yeah.
What happens, you get actual consistent beneficial change, just working in the right direction. If you can do it, if you want to do it, and you will not be overthrown, you will actually start to command the support of your populations.
Yeah.
If you don't do it, then your analogy may well be right.
Well, and the analogy and the consequences of our not finding the way, if there's some purpose in universe to the anti-entropic function, the biological evolutionary process it's the ability to recognize patterns, to see patterns, and problem solve. And that's our principal charge in universe, as it were. And we're at a time when these things should be addressed, and it's going to call for outside the envelope thinking. The creative community, the artistic community, the young should go back and I would suggest go back and pick up on some of the trends that threads that Buckminster Fuller and Norman Cousins and some of the comprehensive thinkers were addressing to this idea that the ontology, the reality has changed as surely as the comet 65 million years ago. The ontology has changed, and we're transcending scarcity. We need a new economic reality, a way of bringing justice to the whole of the system. And if there's any pattern that's needed, all politics is economics. Economic theory is of the essence, and if there's a system that's relevant to bringing that into reality, it's yours. And I want to thank you, Norm, Rodney. You've had your pleasure to have the perceptions of Rodney Shakespeare. We've run out of time. We had a long discussion at a crucial time. Rodney Shakespeare is the co-author of Binary Economics, and he's visiting us from London. He'll be going back, and he's also a tutor and a binary economist. Happy to bring you those perceptions. We in Conversations invite you to tune in, keep the faith, and in these difficult times, and let one and all who have some sort of an idea of what the challenge might be calling us to, try to bring that forth rather than keep it under a basket. Ideas should be advanced rather than not advanced, and if they're not suitable, they can be put down. But let's have people thinking new at these particular times. Please tune in. We'll come back again next week. That's it for this program. Rodney, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Howard. Wow.
So,
it's now or never for young people. They
for
go
the whole,
it's their lives.
for the whole thing.